I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we assess the situation on the front lines as Russian troops occupy Severeodonetsk. On Friday, we spoke about Russia's impending default on foreign debts. This has now happened, the first time since 1918. Our economics reporter Louis Ashworth gives us his analysis. And we're also live from the G7 in Austria.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Monday, the 27th of June, day 124. And alongside Louis Ashworth, I'm joined by the Telegraph's Defence and Security Editor, Nicholls, and our Whitehall Correspondent, Tony Diver, who's calling in live from the G7 summit in Austria. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from the front lines in Ukraine.
Well, hi, David. Hi, everybody. The big news over the weekend is the loss of the city of Severodonetsk in the Donbass, lost by Ukraine to Russian forces. It's been coming for a while now, been under immense pressure in that area, and the city has been absolutely pounded. Russia have pushed forward. They've made these incremental advances, as we've seen over the last few weeks, very, very heavily led with artillery, and then using increasingly less well-trained troops to follow up behind. Ukraine has been slowly ceding ground. We made an assessment last Friday that this was actually a sort of strategic maneuver to slow down the Russians, because Severodonetsk is an important city. It's a big city in the Luhansk Oblast. There's a large steel plant there, but it's not of strategic importance. It's not a big political or cultural or population heavy center. But what it was holding up the Russian advance, and we think that they were trading space slowly for time, but also to get Russia to wear the forces down. So the Ukrainian defence has fallen back slightly to the west to the sister city of Lysychansk on the other side of the river, and on higher ground, so more easily defended, although today the mayor of the city is advising people to leave. The whole area was coming under incredible pressure from Russia, so likely to see that Lysychansk will be ceded as well in the next few days, I would have thought. Elsewhere, there have been a number of missile strikes around the country. We saw footage from Kyiv, which hasn't been hit very recently, and it was struck at the same time as the G7 meeting. So as we've seen before, when the UN Secretary General visited, Russia just makes these statements. Tactically, operationally, strategically pointless. They don't do anything. They've just brought more death and hardship and misery to the civilian population of Ukraine. But we should expect to see that probably over the next few days as the G7 summit winds up, and the NATO summit, more of that later, but the NATO summit kickstarts in Madrid. But interestingly, there's also been a number of deep strikes, so high, long range and precision and precise strikes from Ukraine. So a number of Russian command posts have been hit across the country. A number of arms depots have been hit. There's footage online. You'll find it on social media. Something very big hit a Russian arms depot in the Luhansk Oblast this morning. It could be one of the HIMARS system, the new US high mobility artillery rocket systems, these very long range, very precise artillery systems, or it could be one of the existing Toshka ballistic missiles that we know Ukraine has. It doesn't really matter what was fired, except for two reasons. Firstly, that it hit the target it was going for, seemingly, because it was a very high value target. And secondly, if it was a Toshka missile, that's interesting, because it suggests that Ukraine might actually have the confidence to use what few of these accurate ballistic missiles they have left, because they're being backfilled by HIMARS. A couple of other things to note over the weekend. There's a report on CNN that America is going to provide a Norwegian Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile System, the NASAMS. This is an anti-air missile system, but it's a range of about 25 kilometers, up to 50,000 feet. It's very modern. It's very connected. It uses the NATO Link 16 data module, and what that means is that it can talk to a load of other equipment. So it can be it can take a feed from other radars and other equipments elsewhere to put it onto incoming threats. It's also very clever in that it separates the fire control mechanism and the launchers from the radar and all the other links. So as a system, rather than just the individual pieces of equipment, it's able to take a bit of punishment and have certain elements of that system knocked out and still be able to fire. So it's a Norwegian system. That's the launcher and the control system. But the missile itself is a US missile. It's an AMRAAM, Advanced Medium Range Air-to-Air Missile, is that actually fired. And just one final tactical update. There's been seemingly another round of sackings of Russian senior officers. So we've seen Colonel General Andrei Serdyukov, who's the commander of the airborne forces, the VDV, Russia's airborne forces, has seemingly been sacked. More importantly, Alexander Dvornikov, who's commander of the southern group of forces, but also, we think, the overall operational commander for the entire war has been sacked. You may remember in the first few weeks, Russia seemed to be fighting 4 different wars, 3 army wars, one in the north, one in the east, one in the south, and an air force war as well, and also some naval stuff wobbling around in the Black Sea. But these were completely disjointed. They weren't talking to each other, and we saw them ejected from the north of the country. Then Russia said that actually the priority all along had been the Donbass, and they put Dvornikov in charge of the theatre, the Ukraine theatre, to pull it all together and to make the concert sing. And they have since then had some tactical advances, as we've seen today with Severodonetsk. However, it's been so slow and at such cost that we think that might be why Dvornikov has been replaced. So very interesting that, I mean, regardless of what you might think of the Russian tactics, they would consider it a success that they are slowly creeping west. However, it doesn't scream of being very happy with your command and control and your senior leadership if you are sacking generals left, right and centre. I think I'd better take a break before my voice carks out.
Thank you very much, Dom. Tony Diver, can I come to you next? Dom mentioned a few times in his intro there the G7. You're there. You've been attending. What's happening, and how is Ukraine on the agenda for the G7?
Hi, David. Yeah, well, I think it's fair to say Ukraine is the agenda, actually. Pretty much every session that we've had of the G7 since it started has in some way involved Ukraine. This morning, we had what was probably the most sort of Ukraine-heavy session, and actually President Zelensky himself dialed in to speak to G7 leaders and to urge them to give more support to the country. So they were there discussing defense and security matters, and President Zelensky urged them to try and end the war in Ukraine before the winter. And there were some concerns in Ukraine that actually colder weather advantages Russian forces, whether that's to do with frozen ground and tanks, or whether it's because the Russians are largely shelling and Ukrainians have troops on the ground. There is a feeling that there's a tactical advantage or a strategic advantage to be gained through the cold weather. And so Zelensky's message to Western leaders this morning was pretty clear, and that is, we need to get this over and done with as fast as possible. But more broadly, there has been a sort of geopolitical discussion going on about the war over the course of this summit. And before we turned up here, and before the UK delegation turned up, there was some briefing from UK sources, both in Number 10 and in the Foreign Office. There was a bit of concern that some Western leaders, and the finger was very subtly pointed at President Macron, believed that actually the best way to end this war was to have a negotiated settlement with the Russians sooner rather than later, and that settlement might involve ceding of some territory to the Russians by the Ukrainians. And it could mean, for instance, they say, well, Putin can have the Donbass as long as there is an end to hostilities. And the UK's position has been that that's not the right thing to do, that we're not in the position yet to start negotiating a peace deal, and that the most important thing is that we fight and continue fighting hard and sending military and economic support. So that's been sort of the backdrop to the summit so far. And what's actually happened is statements have gone out this morning, both from Boris Johnson and from the sort of G7 leaders all together in a communique that says that they've all basically come to that conclusion, that they agree with Britain and they think that now is too early to be talking about a peace deal. So a sort of big diplomatic win for Boris Johnson from our point of view, but also sort of more broadly tells us that the G7 leaders are basically saying that the war is here to stay for the time being. But strategically speaking, they would like to get it done before the winter. That, I would say, is probably the top lines that have come out so far. The summit is ending this evening with a nice leaders' barbecue, which unfortunately President Zelensky won't be able to join, given that he was only here virtually. But that will be enjoyed by the other leaders.
So, from everything you've seen, do you get the sense that the united front from the G7 is still there, or are there cracks in the alliance? What do you make of it?
Well, I think there was a feeling before we got here that there might be some cracks, and I think actually we're coming out of it feeling much more like the G7 is united on this stuff, which is very helpful given that the NATO conference begins tomorrow. So we're now sort of heading from a smaller group of Western economic powerhouse countries to a much wider block of Western defence alliance tomorrow. So I think it's quite good, really, that we do feel like we've got some unity in the G7. But I mean, sort of more broadly, that there's always a bit of rumbling on the UK side because the UK views itself as being Zelensky's main ally in the West, even more than America, and because the UK therefore I think Boris Johnson sees himself as a bit of an envoy of President Zelensky and takes it upon himself to tell other leaders what Zelensky would like them to do. Get the feeling perhaps that might be slightly irritating if you're President Macron or Joe Biden, but there's definitely a feeling that the UK is trying to take the lead here. And actually, people in the Foreign Office that I was talking to were saying one of the key things that they've been discussing when we do get to the point where there might be a negotiated peace settlement is who exactly is sitting around the table when that happens. And there is a bit of concern that at the last time there was any discussion of territory in Ukraine and its relationship with Russia, back in the Minsk agreement, where it was decided that Donetsk and Lugansk would get this sort of semi-autonomous status. It was actually France and Germany that were around the table negotiating that with Russia and Ukraine, and not the UK and the US. And there is a feeling in the Foreign Office that when we do get to that point, it's important that the UK continues to have major input, because I think Boris Johnson views himself as quite bullish on this stuff and less willing to roll over. But no, I mean, in answer to your question, this is all stuff in the future. For the time being, it certainly seems like that these leaders are completely united on Ukraine, and the message is keep pumping support in, and even if it hurts domestically at home, even if it costs you a lot of money, this stuff's really worth doing. And Boris Johnson himself said this morning that his phrasing was that some freedom is worth fighting for, and I think that's the message that I think other leaders would agree with.
Thanks, Tony. I think Dom's got a question for you as well.
Yeah, hi Tony. Thanks for calling in. Sounds great. I just wonder if you've got an opinion from from what you're seeing in the Foreign Office in particular, but other officials you're speaking to more broadly, about the shape of security architectures. And what I mean is that this G7 meeting, ostensibly sort of an economic meeting, has been dominated by Ukraine, and albeit the economic aspects of it, but still front and centre there. And notably, Japan obviously is present. And then tomorrow, when the NATO meeting kicks off, Japan, along with Australia, New Zealand and the Republic of Korea, are going to be in the NATO meeting as a sort of observer status. But, so Japan having a foot in both camps there. And I just wonder if you thought that there's a sort of a changing framework to the way that security in the round is being seen now at very senior levels. It's not just the military sphere, it's economics and it's global. Just wonder if you had any view on that.
Yeah, I think definitely. I mean, we know that all of these leaders obviously interact in various different ways in different organisations, don't they? But yeah, I think it does feel like that. It's worth saying, I think, that the majority of the discussion of action that could be taken against Russia that's been had at this summit has been economic, and there's been lots of discussion of sanctions, for instance. All the G7 countries have announced new sanctions on imports of Russian gold, which is Russia's second largest import, so that's designed to sort of hit Russia in the wallet. There's also been discussion of putting a price cap on Russian oil exports to, stop Russia basically benefiting from global rise in oil prices. But yeah, I mean, it has felt largely economic, and I think you probably would expect that for the G7. But I mean, from a domestic point of view, a lot of these countries are talking about how you tackle the cost of living crisis and deal with domestic budgets. And, obviously a lot of what that money is being spent on is military kit, it's military training and all that sort of thing. So, yeah, I mean, I think it will perhaps feel to these leaders going into NATO tomorrow that they're having some of the same conversations again, although obviously the NATO summit will be, much more military focused, and there'll be far more countries there. So, yeah, I mean, inevitably with these things, there's a bit of an overlap. But I think it's probably good that we've dealt with a lot of those economic issues and we can now focus on the military stuff next week or later this week.
Thank you very much, Tony, for that. Can I bring in, talking about overlapping concerns here, can I bring in Louis Ashworth, our economics reporter? We've talked about oil caps in Russia and also bans on imports of gold. Louis, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so as Dom and Tony were saying, there's a very heavily economic element to all this. And we've seen one sort of solid plan emerging from the G7 today, which is this new initiative to ban new gold imports coming in from Russia. And we're also seeing the beginnings of a development of a second policy, which would involve a price cap on Russian oil. So on the first one, it's a very symbolic kind of change. So Russia, as we know and as we've discussed before, the key part of its sort of export engine that supports its economy so much is oil. But gold is also a very important one. There are a lot of big gold producers and refiners in Russia. And so it's a very important part of the sort of trade picture for them, this precious metal space. The G7 have said that they want to ban new gold imports. That obviously will have an effect, but at this point it's quite symbolic. One of the big factors here is that the London Bullion Market Association, which is a big sort of certifying body for the gold industry, already removed gold refiners from its accreditation list back in March. So in effect, this is an area where the industry self-sanctioned itself months ago, and we're only just now seeing the politics catch up with that. Now, there hasn't been a total shutdown of gold exports from Russia. There have been examples recently of some Swiss companies bringing in Russian gold, but already, again, this is an area where it's been quite tightly locked down. This is a good sort of thing to add. It's another sort of chip on the sanctions pile, but ultimately in and of itself not a hugely effective sanction at this point. Warren Patterson, who's head of commodity strategy at ING, the Dutch bank, said the impact likely to be fairly limited given the industry are ready to take steps to restrict Russian gold. It looks as though it's largely symbolic. So that is kind of the long and short of it. What's more interesting is the sort of second economic policy that's being drawn up, which is to try and introduce a cap on the price of Russian oil. So, as we've discussed previously, when I was on the podcast, last week or the week before, talking about sanctioned Russian oil. So Russian oil has been selling at a steep discount to the sort of benchmark Brent crude for a while, basically since the start of the conflict. Brent crude's around just above $100 a barrel. You can get Russian Urals crude for more like $70 a barrel. What the G7 are looking at doing now is trying to introduce a price cap on Urals crude, which would essentially, it would have a sort of two-sided effect. And you can see why politicians have been drawn to this. So on the one hand, by setting a price cap, you would reduce the amount of revenue that Russia is getting, which obviously is very important. Oil is absolutely integral to the Russian economy, and if you can reduce the price for it, you can really hurt Moscow's kind of war chest for the war in Ukraine, and indeed all elements of how the state operates. The flip side of this as well is that by attempting to reduce the price, and effectively what they're suggesting here is creating a buyer's cartel. So everyone begins communicating with each other, everyone agrees they won't spend over a certain amount, and in that way you can effectively force down the price. By creating that buyer's cartel, they would then be hoping to try and take some of the heat out of the global oil market. If you reduce prices for Russian oil, those places that are still buying that oil will almost certainly then go for Russian oil because it's so cheap. They then won't be competing as much for oil from other places like Saudi Arabia, other parts of the Middle East. And in that case, you then hope that you might reduce the oil price globally generally. Now, remember that in basically all the G7 countries that are here, probably fair exception should be noted for Japan, most of these leaders are coping with inflationary crises at home. The cost of living crisis is not just a UK thing; it's a sort of across the West and across most of the world kind of thing currently. It's a kill two birds with one stone kind of situation, because if you can successfully get the price down, you'll both be hurting Russia, and you'll hopefully then, as a knock-on effect, be reducing energy prices at home and trying to take some of that pressure out of inflation. As we discussed before, a lot of, certainly in Europe, they're bringing in, in the US, they've already largely stopped the imports of Russian fuel. The EU is preparing to make illegal seaborne imports of Russian fuel. So really, actually, the people this is directed at are China and India. And what we're seeing here is the beginnings of some kind of a quid pro quo. So again, going back, the EU a few weeks ago introduced these new sanctions that prevent ships, Russia-affiliated ships that are carrying Russian oil, from accessing the European insurance market and the London insurance market, which is absolutely crucial because insurance is integral to how the shipping industry works. What we're seeing probably begin to develop here is a situation in which Russia and China may be, China and India may be induced to go along with introducing this price cap. And in exchange, there may be exemptions introduced to allow them to access those insurance markets. So there's a bit of give and take here. It's going to be a bit of a difficult sell, actually, particularly within the EU, because it was quite a struggle to even get that ban on insurance through the EU. So a lot of kind of moving pieces here and a lot of difficult political challenges. But yeah, that's kind of the economic side of what we've seen develop.
Great. I wonder if I could just jump in there, David, if you don't mind, because they've got a bit of breaking news on this topic, which is coming out of the Schloss Elmau, which is just up the road from where I am now, where the G7 summit is taking place. There has been a briefing for reporters by the US National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, who's given us a bit more of an idea, partly of what President Zelensky has been saying in that meeting this morning that we were discussing earlier, and also on what the US aid package might look like. And obviously, as I just said to Dom, a lot of this is economic. It's about sanctions, and it's about how economies can deal with the fight against Russia in Ukraine. But actually, what the National Security Advisor has told reporters, he says, if you don't mind me quoting, he says, "I can confirm that we're in the process of finalising a package that includes advanced air defence capabilities, and that President Biden told President Zelensky that we intend to finalise a package that includes advanced medium and long-range air defence capabilities for the Ukrainians and some other items of urgent need, including ammunition for artillery and counter-battery radar systems." So clearly there's a bit of there is actually a bit of hard defence chat going on here. It's not just purely economics. The other thing I think is of interest is a bit of briefing here about President Zelensky. They're saying that Zelensky told the G7 countries that he needed more air defence capabilities, and that's a direct response to the recent attacks in Kyiv, which happened overnight and the night previously. I think it's quite interesting that those attacks coincided with the G7 summit, and I was actually talking to someone in Downing Street last night who said that they thought it was pretty stupid of Vladimir Putin to launch this attack on Kyiv at exactly the time that all of these leaders were meeting in Germany for the G7, because all it would do is stiffen the resolve of these Western leaders, because they would be meeting with Zelensky, albeit virtually, and it would basically mean that they would be more likely to take action against him. So that's, an interesting piece of breaking news there. Then if anything more comes through, then I'll let you know. But interesting briefing there from the US side, I would say.
Yeah, that's Dom here again, Tony. That's great. Thanks for that. It's really interesting. That air defence system that Jake Sullivan's talking about is almost certainly going to be the NASAMS that I mentioned at the start, the Norwegian Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile System. So that's undoubtedly what's going into Ukraine now. Just a reminder, that's a Norwegian launcher and control system, but it's actually a US missile, the US AMRAAM, Advanced Medium Range Air-to-Air Missile, that comes out the tube. Range of 25 kilometres, up to about 50,000 feet. But most importantly, it runs on the NATO Link 16 data tactical data link network, and therefore can take feeds from a number of different systems and can disperse its own data across the network and can act in a dispersed manner. So the control system can be away from the radar, which can be away from the launcher. So if any part of it is attacked, it doesn't mean that the whole system is going to be taken off the battlefield. So yeah, that's undoubtedly the NASAM system that Jake Sullivan, the US National Security Advisor, has just been talking about.
Thank you very much, Dom, and thank you, Tony, for that breaking news from you there in Austria. It's astonishing, really. There's been so much going on that we're 25 minutes into talking. We've only just got to the huge economic news of the past 24 hours. Louis, can you talk us through Russia's default? This is something you previewed for us last week.
Well, it's very generous of you, David, to say I've only previewed this last week. I was looking back, and I've been writing about this for well over 3 months now, so it's been a long time coming. But we're finally there. Russia has defaulted on its foreign debts for the first time in a century. So as I sort of said last Friday, There was a coupon payment of $100 million that Moscow was supposed to make on bonds on the 27th of May. It failed to make that payment. The 30-day grace period subsequent to that has lapsed. And as a result, default has occurred. So it's the first time Russia has failed to pay its foreign creditors since 1918. When the sort of Bolsheviks repudiated the Tsar's debts. It has defaulted in the period since. In 1998, it defaulted on its domestic debts. But this is the first time it's failed to pay those foreign bondholders in over a century. This default was very expected. We essentially knew with certainty this was going to happen for the last several weeks because the US had effectively cut off the system by which Russia would have made this payment. So the US had previously allowed bondholders to receive payments from Russia as part of an exemption that was introduced when sanctions were first brought in response to the invasion. That exemption was allowed to lapse. Payment effectively became illegal, and at that point, default became inevitable. But it has now occurred. We don't really expect there to be a sort of immediate effect from this. The sort of key moment at which the impact of this will be felt is when Russia or perhaps Russian corporations next go to Western markets to tap them up for funding. That may not be for a while. I mean, you're certainly not going to see the Kremlin sort of knocking on the doors of Wall Street and asking for loans anytime soon. They're already pariahs to the Western financial system, and that side is probably already knocked out, even if this default hadn't occurred. Nonetheless, it's a huge symbolic blow to Putin. Putin, for sort of very, very swift history, he arrived as Russian president at a time when the country's financial reputation was very poor, a time of huge inflation, a time when people were very uncertain about Russia's stability as a kind of emerging economy at that time. And to his credit, he's done a lot to turn Russia into a very stable economy, very sort of reliable payer of its debts, sort of very, very fiscally conservative and stable country. And it's interesting to see now that as a result of this conflict, we've seen inflation has shot up. We've now seen it default. A lot of the things that he came into power saying, I'm the antidote to this, I'm stopping this, are coming to pass again as a result of this action he's taken. So interesting sort of things going kind of full circle there. Russia, as a result of the sort of context of this default, has essentially brushed it off. They've said, we're willing and able to make these payments. This is engineering by the White House effectively that has done this. If we could pay, then we would pay, but you've stopped us. Anton Silyanov, the finance minister, said before he's called the situation a farce. He says anyone can declare whatever they like, but anyone who understands what's going on knows this is in no way a default. So that's the sort of where we are with things at the moment, and it might be a little while before we see the clear effects of this begin to pan out.
That's fascinating. I mean, for the Russian argument, we would pay, but we can't because the Americans cut us off. What does that mean? Has anything like this happened before?
It's a good question. I mean, there's precedents with. I think Iran is probably the clear one that you go to, a country which has been kind of cut off from the Western financial system in that way, but it wasn't as sort of embedded as Russia was before this conflict happened. So no, there isn't a particularly clear precedent in many ways. And the other substantial part of this, to that willingness point, is normally when a country defaults on its sovereign debt, it's because the country is completely broke. It's out of money. It's doing everything it can to continue the operations of its own government, to support its own population. And it hasn't. You then don't pay your foreign creditors because you just don't have the money, and it's very low priority. I mean, if you have a choice between do we have money to keep the lights running in our country, or the money to pay whatever Wall Street bank this coupon, you're always going to pick trying to keep the lights on in your own country, because otherwise your government collapses. Russia is not at all a situation like that. Russia has huge amounts of money and can very easily make these payments should it want to from the reserves that it has. But it's been rendered unable, and that is a very unusual situation. it's also a difficult situation as well because, as I said before, Russia is not likely anytime soon to need to go to the West and get money, because that's the other side of it. Is if you look at a country such as Sri Lanka, which recently defaulted, there's the element of the default itself. They have no choice but to do it, but then they still need those foreign markets. They need to go to foreign creditors and get the money to rebuild their economy, which has collapsed. Russia's economy has not collapsed. Russia doesn't need to go to those markets. So it's a weird sort of double-sided situation. They are in effect, in terms of if we look within the very narrow scope of the sovereign debt, of who they owe money to, of the situation of their creditors, Russia's effectively unscathed. But this disconnect has still happened because of the US actions. So it's a very weird and unusual situation. So Levon Kemeryan, who's associate director at Scope Ratings, which is a sort of big European ratings agency, said the default on Russia's foreign debt has limited near-term financial implications and should not compromise the state's ability to finance itself for now. Russia continues to benefit from substantive windfall gains from its oil and gas exports due to high energy prices, reducing the need to borrow in foreign debt markets. Russia's access to foreign debt markets is mostly closed anyhow for the moment. So that's kind of where we are. It's a very weird situation, and not one that we have any kind of clear precedent for.
Well, thank you very much, Louis, for talking us through that. I wonder if Tony or Dom have any observations, anything to add to this, and maybe any questions for Louis.
Yeah, actually, Lou, I thought that was really interesting. I just wondered what if there's any domestic political implications for this in the US. I mean, obviously, a lot of these debts are owed to Wall Street banks, as you point out. Are these banks able to exercise any sort of pressure on the White House or any attempt to get President Biden to do something that might lead to them recouping that money, or is it basically just accepted or ensured that this stuff is going to get written off because of the situation that Russia's in?
That's a really good question, and this was one of the big debates that was occurring as we approached the point at which the US kind of cut off this exemption and effectively made it so the default was inevitable. As Tony alludes to there, these debts were held by financial institutions, by banks, by asset managers, by hedge funds. They will now probably in the short term not receive those payments, and yeah, there was pressure from Wall Street, to use the sort of broadest possible term for the US financial industry, onto the White House. And there were kind of two sides to that pressure, because on the one hand you had people saying, well, we own these bonds, we should get this money, we're financial institutions, you can't just stop us receiving this payment, don't you support business, etc. And then there was the other side of it, which was every time Russia made a payment, it was money going out of Russia and into the West, so why would you stop that? And this was a very live debate, and in the end it seems to be that basically the White House took the decision, we're introducing all these different sanctions, lots of them have business impacts that hurt us as well as Russia. We just have to hope they hurt Russia more than us. And this is basically where they appear to have landed with it. This was an active decision. Janet Yellen, the US Treasury Secretary, was talking about this a lot, that they had this choice, and clearly they've gone with this option. They've deemed that it's a big enough symbolic blow to deal to go ahead with it. In terms of the scale of the damage, there's again a sort of couple of sides to this. So the first one is that overall Russia's foreign debt is not huge. A lot of it's held actually more focused in Europe than in the US, but it's not a massive borrower, and so we're not talking about a sort of material impact to Western markets from this money not coming in. It's not the case that Russia's not going to be paying out on its bonds, and therefore you're going to see a bank collapse somewhere because they were too invested in it. It's not that sort of level of there's not that level of exposure to it. The other side of this is that now that Russia has defaulted on these debts, there are still 3 years for bondholders. So most bonds have different covenants, but often they have broadly similar features to them. The covenants for these particular bonds that Russia has defaulted on stipulate that the holders have 3 years to try and make a claim if the debt is not paid. That's a very interesting period of time, because that is enough time that conceivably you could imagine that the conflict in Ukraine might end, that there might be some element of rehabilitation, that Russia might you have how we return to Western markets. There might be a sort of thawing of those kind of tensions. And if that happens, it's very easy to imagine a situation in which those bondholders do actually get paid. It will just be a few years down the line rather than right now. So sort of open questions there. And there is that impact and there has been that tension. But overall, we've seen that the US has basically gone down this path of trying to deal a symbolic blow to Putin. And that seems to have dictated the overall action here.
Just one question from me, Louis, if I may. There seems to be sufficient grey areas around this decision that I wonder what your view would be on the credibility of the White House coming after this. If there's, Russia's masters in whataboutery. You put that point to them and they say, but what about this? You did this over here, and they just sort of blur the argument. It's very difficult to land a blow. And I just wonder if this is a default, but you are able to make a very strong argument for Russia to have the ability to pay, as you've described. I just wonder if this has actually damaged the White House at all, and is in some ways a bit of a gift for Putin in that it gives him more ammunition the next time we want to talk about Russia's economic viability on the open market. They can always say, well, what about that? You did that, so we're perfectly able to get our hands on some loot. So just what's your view of the credibility of this decision from America?
Yes, it's a great point. And I think, obviously, as you said, there is this whataboutery approach that Russia takes. I think it's not difficult to, sympathy is completely the wrong word, but Russia's position in this is extremely understandable. Russia, has tried to make these payments, and they have tried to be good debtors. Now, I'm sure there are lots of people who are creditors to Russia who hopefully now are wishing they hadn't become creditors to Russia, but nonetheless they are, and Russia has tried to pay them back. Whether it damages the White House is a difficult one. It's certainly, as sanctions go, it's one of the ones that feels a little bit more, perhaps. Again, it's difficult. I wanted to use the word vindictive there because it is such a kind of we can press this exact button and we can make this thing happen. It's engineered in that sense. It's very difficult to say how sort of morally that plays out though, because I think there are probably a lot of people who would say, good. It doesn't matter if it's hugely artificial. All sanctions on Russia are a good idea, and we should be doing as much as we can to make Russia a pariah. And even if this is a very artificial and engineered default, it can still have practical implications. So an element of this is that if you're a Western investor, you might, for instance, say to your clients, we don't invest in the debt of countries that are deemed to have defaulted, or we have certain standards about how reliable debtors countries are before we lend them money. In those instances, those financial institutions may, by their own rules, not be allowed to lend money to Russia. The bigger impact then may come if these sanctions kind of can have a kind of contagion effect onto Russian corporations. Looking at it that way, there is a kind of material impact here that will occur, and so for the White House to have done this is a sort of strategically sound move, because even if it feels like a kind of weird way to go about doing it, if it's going to hurt Russia's economy, it's a good thing to do. Is the sort of logic of sanctions. So I think in that instance, in that case, actually, if you really sort of look at this in the broad, it makes sense as a strategic move for the White House to do this, and the reasons that they've done it make a lot of sense and will have a serious impact. But I agree with you that Russia will probably find it very easy to make themselves the victim in this, and they will have a strong argument for saying that they are.
Thanks. And sorry, I know I said I had one question, but of course I always have another. My personal beef. What's China going to think about this? So
China is very interesting. So Chinese banks are probably the crucial player here. It's going to be a question of whether Chinese banks are willing to lend money to Russia as a state, or perhaps more significantly Russian corporations. If they do so, there's sort of twin risks basically for Russian banks. The first one is for Chinese banks. There's sort of twin risks for Chinese banks. So the first one is that they might be hit by secondary sanctions. So it's a very difficult. We've seen after initial kind of coordinated volleys of sanctions, sanctions have been building up piece by piece all over the world towards Russia, and Chinese banks have got to tread very carefully to ensure that they don't put themselves in a situation where they kind of can't operate without violating those Western sanctions. Because no matter how important the relationship between Russia and China is, for now, China's relationship with the West is the more significant one, and it is absolutely crucial to those Chinese banks as well. So there's that element. They have to sort of tiptoe around that. Secondly, if Russia is deemed to have defaulted, it means there's going to be the prospect of debt restructuring talks in the future, and that is going to create a situation in which Chinese banks are going to have a big sort of risk premium on the loans that they're giving to Russia. So just operating with Russia is going to become much more expensive. So it's extra cost, extra complexity. So far, we've seen that it looks like Chinese banks are very hesitant to lend money to Russia at the moment. I suspect a default will only intensify that and make it less and less appealing. So I wouldn't say that channel's completely cut off, but it makes it more difficult from a Chinese perspective as well. So it does also have that impact.
Well, thank you very much for that, Louis. That was comprehensive, and I think you've given us all a much better understanding of the impact and the implications of Russia's default today. I think we're starting to come to the end of our time here. So I just asked Dom, you're off to the NATO summit over the next few days. What should we expect from that? What could come from Madrid?
Sure, just very quickly. So NATO summit kicks off tomorrow. It's kind of started already-ish, but tomorrow and Wednesday, the big days. Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, has already spoken this morning, saying that the focus is going to be reaffirming that number one, Russia is the very clear priority adversary against which NATO is built. But number two, China's coming up on the rails. And number three, terrorism and out-of-area operations. Jens Stoltenberg also says that the enhanced forward presence mission, that sort of the forces along the eastern flank are going to be increased to brigade level. They're about battle group level at the moment, about 600 people in each of the eight countries along the eastern flank, going to go up to a brigade, so roughly 3 times the size. The big thing from this NATO conference is going to be what they call the comprehensive assistance package for Ukraine. What is going to happen for Ukraine? A lot of the big decisions about whether to support, when to support, for how long to support is kind of the political leaders' domain. Of course, these are not totally divorced. I mean, G7 and NATO, a lot of the same people are going, clearly, but a lot of the decisions are sort of in different fields. But we're going to get a lot more sort of meat on the bones of what the military decisions are from NATO. And NATO, Jens Stoltenberg says that NATO is going to help Ukraine, particularly on secure comms, anti-drone systems, and fuel. Now, NATO doesn't have a lot of stuff of itself. Of course, all the vast majority of the kit is owned by those national governments. So NATO doesn't have a lot of stuff, but it's talking about secure comms systems, anti-drone, and fuel. So it's about all it can really do from its own stocks. But what it is going to do is going to try and help Ukraine move from or transfer from former Soviet natures of equipment and calibers and so on and so forth onto NATO equipment. And interestingly, for this NATO conference, it's going to be joined by Australia, Japan, Republic of Korea, New Zealand, Georgia, and the EU. So a lot of out of areas as NATO starts to take a view and offer an opinion on China and other security challenges around the rest of the world. So you get these other countries who are major regional players, major world players, major global players in many respects, attending these events. So it'll be interesting to see what NATO says about Ukraine in particular, but also a view that it has more broadly about global events. Just one final thing, Jens Stoltenberg has announced that tomorrow morning, first thing on Tuesday, he's going to be having a meeting with the leaders of Turkey, Sweden and Finland. They are, I wouldn't say desperate, but they'd be very, very keen to finish this conference with that whole Sweden-Finland accession to NATO issue done and dusted, have Turkey on board, nice big smiles, handshakes, photo calls, all that kind of stuff, have that bit put to bed at this NATO conference. They'd be very, very keen for that to happen. And he's out the blocks first thing tomorrow to try and get something kicked off on that front. But I'll let you know. I'll be there over the next couple of days, and I'll be reporting in as normal.
Well, I'll see you there, Dom, because I'm flying over from Germany tomorrow as well. So we'll let's catch up. I might just make a point about the politics of this. I think that point you made about Stoltenberg meeting Turkey, Sweden, and Finland is interesting. It's also worth pointing out that over the course of these two summits, both at the G7 and at NATO, Joe Biden is only meeting the host countries. So he's meeting Olaf Scholz here, and he's meeting with the Spanish over in Spain. The one exception that he's made to that rule is that he wants to meet President Erdogan, and that's going to happen at NATO as well. So that gives you a sense of how much of a political priority the Turkey question is at this NATO summit. And just from the British side, I mean, the British have been trying to get a bilateral, as far as I understand, with the Americans, and have not been very successful so far. So that's in itself quite interesting. From the British point of view, we need to think a little bit about what the win might be from Boris Johnson at NATO, and sort of outside of those quite complex policy questions that you were just chatting us through, Dom. I think one of the main lines that's come out of both Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary, and indeed Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, who are also going to be there this week, is that the line that we always hear is that the NATO 2% defence spending commitment is a floor, not a ceiling, and there has always been this feeling from the Brits that perhaps other countries could be pulling their weight a bit more in terms of funding. So, I mean, it's slightly inevitable that at these conferences you end up having a quite crude discussion about funding and spending commitments, while at the same time you're trying to negotiate these pretty complex geopolitical and technological questions. But I think there probably will be some calls from the British for other countries to be spending more money on this, and clearly the conflict in Ukraine will be the justification that the British make for that.
Thank you, Tony. Louis, can I come quickly to you for your final thoughts? And then I'd just like to come back to Dom to give us a sense of what the tactical and strategic situation in Ukraine itself looks like over the next few days. So Louis Ashworth first, please.
Thanks, David. Yeah, very brief final thoughts from me. Just that the efforts to kind of put a cap on Russian oil prices, again, it sort of brings us back to this overarching point with everything we discuss about Russia's economy and Western sanctions is unless you tackle Russian oil, unless you do things to cut off and reduce the amount that Russian oil can do for the Kremlin, you're not really committed to sanctions whatsoever. So it's very interesting to see what they can manage to do on that front and how that affects sort of relations with India and China. It's the absolutely crucial point of this entire. It goes above and beyond just this conflict, but it is the crucial point here. And so, what, if anything, the G7 can agree on that is going to be very interesting to look out for.
Yeah, just to finish off. One very minor point, just quickly on NATO, talking about funding there. Only 9 of the NATO members currently meet the 2% spending rule. 19 have plans to reach it by 2024. So it is a thorny issue and will be grappled with. In terms of final thoughts over the next few days, very likely that Russia are going to throw everything, including the stolen kitchen sink, at Lysychansk. Also likely, therefore, I think that Ukraine will pull back and will cede that territory, because then Russia will have taken the Luhansk Oblast, and they will. That's a chance for them to say, "Hey, great victory," and maybe make a decision to do something else. There are almost no chance that they can keep pushing to recover the ground, or to take the ground, in the Donetsk Oblast, which would then complete the whole of the Donbass, because Russia is tired. It's worn out. The fighters are tired. The equipment is broken and old. They cannot keep pushing west. So I think Ukraine will cede the territory, knowing that Russia have to take the rest of Luhansk Oblast, because that's all they can do before they kind of slump over the finish line. And then we'll see what Russia really wants to get out of this. And of course, all the while this is going on, those US HIMARS and the multiple launch rocket systems and the other very high capability weapon systems are flowing into the Ukrainian arsenal, and they are using it to fight back. So I think we'll see some long range fires, some more of these arms depots and command posts being targeted by Ukraine, just as the war in that sort of Severodonetsk pocket kind of grinds to an attritional halt. But I think there'll be an interesting point a question to ask. Russia will ask themselves at that point whether they carry on, whether they can carry on, and from Ukraine, if they really take the fight into that deep battle.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis, and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly with us by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Sophie Coe.